Yeah, and we, this has been kind of our internal dialogue about this. That it's kind of part between two ferns and part car talk. So pretty informal. And I've been thinking a lot about uncertainty. I think with the COVID virus, with the all of the change that's going on around racial inequities, and with people starting businesses, trying to keep their businesses afloat, there's a lot of uncertainty. And it's interesting because I think in some ways there's always this much uncertainty, but it's really showing because there's a lot of change required and innovation required to actually be, to ride this wave, to push this wave, to do all the things that we need to do to have, to engage our community in the way that we do, whatever that way is, and to actually have successful businesses.
Yeah, so that's a sort of a great opening. There's a good question that kind of landed around that from James here, which is how much has investor activity changed with COVID-19? When do you anticipate it will return to normal levels?
Yeah, I mean, we keep seeing that sort of slide. Now, what we've done is, we built a $6 million fund, and we've been actively deploying that over the last few months. So we've done a handful of investments in the last 3 months. And we actually did our first investment where we did not meet the person in person, which was an interesting thing. It was all via Zoom and phone. And we're kind of used to having that face to face. But I think, what we see in terms of, who knows when it will return, but the way we're sort of looking at it is in 2021, things will open back up, and that this is a time to have really tight cash management, survive, and then look at sustaining through the fall and then toward growth in 2021. And I haven't seen anything that would really change that look, but I think it depends on a lot of things. And one of them is, will there be a resurgence of COVID? And then things have to be shut down again, and some other, factors. But those are my thoughts. What about you, Robert?
Yeah, no, I would echo all those. I think that, if you're trying to fundraise or you are fundraising, your cash runway is always important. If you think about how much you're raising or what the cash inflow will do and how long it'll support you, I think it's even more important now. I mean, we generally stay pretty dialed in of, we want to basically let whatever round is being raised, support the business for, a fair amount of time. But I think if you can be proactive about that, right? And it's like, look, what is it that is going to get you through the end of the year, right? Just let's assume that things just flatline, right? Or maybe that they regress a little bit. Especially if you have a focus or exposure to lines of business that are kind of in retail, consumer discretionary, some of these others that really got a shock to the system. I mean, we've got whatever the real numbers are, right? We're knocking on the door of 20% unemployment. And so I think there's some ripple effects that come around that. So I think you've got to be conversational about the macro environment and how it impacts you. There was I think I'd shared this last week as well. One of the folks I pay attention to was kind of talking about they're interested in seeing what comes out of this in terms of net new ventures, right? So you've had this massive dislocation of people. Talent is now available. Smart talent works on new things. In 3 months or in 6 months, like what new investment opportunities will be out there. So you may get a little bit of that if you're thinking about fundraising and people sitting on their gunpowder a little bit. But as Julie said, we've continued to execute our plan. We did a fully remote, investment. So that's not new to us. We've kind of been a distributed agile group anyway, in terms of how we work.
What's interesting is I read something the other day, Robert, because we're doing, a lot of reading right now just to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of how things are changing. And the guy said, if someone tells you what is going to happen in the next 6 months, they're wrong. So there's a lot of modeling, there's a lot of opinion, but in a time like this, the basics the fundamentals of running a business become really important. When there's a lot of money around, everybody thinks they're smarter than they are. And so having that really, tight cash management, making sure that your relationships with the customers that you do have are dialed in, using the time, if there is a slowdown in your business, to really look at your tech stack or whatever it is that you can to really retool your business and be ready. But I think, keeping active in making sure that all of those lanes are managed is really important.
Mm-hmm. So Will has asked a question here. What's the latest thinking on the Ben Venture Conference? Which is pretty specific. It's not our event. That's EDCO's event. I haven't gotten any update or any information from them on that. But I think there's a broader question here. Are there virtual investor conferences / events coming up that you would recommend? It's a good question. In the future, will they be mostly virtual, more efficient, less expensive for founders, for sure? But of course, you lose some of the personal touch. So there's kind of a lot embedded in there. So like I said, I don't have any information on the Ben Venture Conference. You can ping EDCO and get a feel from them where that is. I think the, off the top of my head, I don't have like the next sort of virtual investor thing for you to sign up for. I will say that, Techstars did a whole virtual thing this year with all their various different nooks and crannies. There's been a lot of groups that have been sort of generally potentially either event restricted or geographically restricted. I got something from a robotics and AI thing out of Pittsburgh, not where we invest, right? But it's just kind of interesting that it's sort of broadened the audience that a lot of these accelerators and incubators and all sorts of things have been able to do. So I don't know if it's a function of people have time because everyone's kind of stuck at home or has been stuck at home, that there's more of those. But they're pretty good. I think Techstars did a good job of kind of giving the snippet, a couple of minute pitch, and then the right information. Another one that I was looking at, it actually, had like breakout rooms, and that gets a little logistically complex. I mean, ultimately what you're trying to do with these is just get your point across that someone's interested enough in having a follow-up conversation, right, that you're trying to close to. So I don't know. There's a lot embedded within that answer, Jill. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I mean, I think that all the conferences and all the events that we would normally see during the late summer and the fall, we have not had any updates on those. And you raise an interesting point, though, because it could be, it'd be nice to have some forums like that in Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest over the next 6 months as kind of an efficiency and a booster, for the startups. So it'll be interesting to see what the organizations that host those events decide to do.
Yeah, for sure.
Where our plan right now is to open an application period someplace in the early mid-August timeframe. So that is something for those of you that are on the line that are thinking that you might want to apply to Cascade Angels for funding. That'll be an open application period. So if you're interested in doing that, what you might want to do is go to Gust and look at the criteria and see if there's a match there, because we do have a list of really clear criterion for what we look for in opportunities.
For sure. Well, keep rolling the questions in as this goes forward. And, Julie and I kicked around an idea to spend the time we have with you all today on kind of in the theme of demystifying investment decision-making. And so most funds, plus or minus, have some type of output or narrative or summary they'll write about an investment to justify it. Call this an investment memo. It's what we label it on our end. It's an important thing to understand, is being prepared about you. There are some investors that'll just sort of, see which way the wind blows and decide to make a decision. But even within that, I think there's a little more to it. But yeah, it's a multi-page document. It's the type of thing that is it's an artifact. And I think that you'll find this with funds more than maybe individual angels. because a fund, we have a responsibility to the investors that have all invested in our fund, which requires a little more regimen of diligence and review of opportunities. So we thought we'd spend a little bit of time on that. And, some of this is going to be stuff you understand, right? So it's already in your pitch deck in terms of, market size, but there's a little more nuance to it that we thought would be kind of revealing. So we'll spend a little time on that. And if that's not interesting to you, distract us another direction, please.
Yeah, ask a bunch of questions that aren't related to that, and we'll move on to that. So let's talk a little bit about how we get to the investment memo, and some of the things that are important for us to have from the companies in terms of making it happen. So we have a defined process, right? We do these application periods, and then what happens, Robert?
Well, so we try to be super clear about what we look for. So think about this, and I think about fundraising as a sales process, right? It's your qualification criteria. We are an Oregon first, Pacific Northwest interested seed stage investor that invests in technology and consumer products, right? So there's a lot embedded within that. So that's kind of an initial filter. Talk about the 3 boxes that we like to have checked. Can you build the thing you think you can build? We're not a concept stage investor. Does anybody care beyond your friends and your family? So you've gotten some signal from the market. And does anybody care enough to pay? Right. So sometimes the usage will override the dollars, but we are generally not a pre-revenue investor. So those are all criteria. So we get on the other side of those. We like to have a conversation, and it's a 30-minute phone conversation that is less the pitch and more the story, right? Because this is about opportunity cost. You're an entrepreneur, you're working on something, you could be doing something else. Like, why are you doing this versus something else? And that's when you begin to unpack a lot of things around, have you lived this problem? Are you not going to stop until you fix this problem? Like motivation, which I think is super, super important.
Just interject here for a second.
Yeah.
Let's fold in a couple of the questions into what you're saying. So one of them is from a company that's solved a global problem, and only has a little bit of revenue. Would they be eligible for seed funding in this thing about, have you built it? Do people care? And will people pay for it? And then also, what about SaaS companies and getting funding?
Okay. So I'll put this in context of the first question. So the first question would be, for us, back to our qualification criteria, right? Yep. I don't know where you're located. I assume you're in the region. We'd have to understand a little bit more about the business. This is the question that came in here. So I think those are sort of initial things. And where the conversation goes, then is around, not so much is this a business, right? If you can sell it for more than it costs you to make it, you have a business. This is back to, is there an investment case that can be built on this business? And this is back to, will equity capital or outside capital compress the time it takes to grow? Right. And then there's some potential exit opportunity within 5 to 7 years on that. Right. So that's not always aligned with how you want to build your business, but that's what comes with taking external capital, right, from a fund, even a small fund like ours. That's the lens you're going to begin to look at through. So I think that answers the first question. And then, do you see SaaS startups getting funding easier or harder now? My background's in software. I like SaaS businesses. I like SaaS businesses that solve kind of like unsexy workflow, domain-centric things. I think there's real opportunity in businesses where anytime people go to a spreadsheet to circumvent an existing system, like, there's a SaaS opportunity. Like, if you have SAP and it sucks and it's hard to use and it's expensive, and to write the run report you need, or to sort of, do whatever you need to do, you got to go to a spreadsheet. I think there's SaaS opportunities there, and SaaS business models are super appealing, right? It takes a while to get the flywheel running in terms of subscription-based revenue. But I think those are super appealing. I think what we would poke into, and I think most investors would, is what is the sort of contract value of the deals you're selling at a SaaS business, and how long does it take you to close those? Which means, if you have an 18-month sales cycle because you're selling to a highly regulated industry like financial services, and your average contract value is $10,000, the math's off, right? If the average contract value is $1 million or $250,000, then you can sort of fund and support that longer sales cycle. So I think that's some of the economics that would come into it in terms of looking at a SaaS investment opportunity.
So say somebody goes on, we have this application period and somebody applies and they meet that early criterion and we do a call and we decide we're going to go ahead. What happens then? And can you talk about a little bit about the importance of record keeping as far as due diligence?
Yes. So if the conversation goes well, right, and again, this is just sort of like sitting down for a cup of coffee, beer, beverage of your choice, whatever it is, conversationally. What we will then want to do is we have, I'm trying to think the number. We've done 200 or so of these calls in 2020, right? 30 minutes generally on Wednesday mornings. It's how we optimize our time and yours. If those go well, the first Tuesday of every month, we have what we call a deal review team meeting. And that's actually the time to pitch. And that's a 30-minute, take your deck and go through it. And the way our process works, because not only, Julie and I are essentially making the investment decisions here, but we have an investment committee, which is made up of our investors, which weigh heavily on our decisioning, right? And it's designed to help them or have them help us bring their expertise, their network, their perspective, and that we record those 30-minute pitches, right? And that then becomes an artifact in our process, right? So not everybody can come to the meeting, but you can go on and you can kind of see this thing. So that's the next step in our process. And I've got some conversion metrics as well. I think, we get maybe 25% go from screening call to deal review team conversation. But again, this has kind of been our back end. Like, what are we doing, right? We're sort of tracking that. Okay, we'll have this first sort of artifact we create, which is the pitch. If that goes well, and what that means is that the gate that you're trying to get through is that after that deal review team meeting is that Julie and I are like, yes, this is interesting enough that we should begin a due diligence process. And that is also structured. And that has sort of two dimensions to it. One is kind of business diligence. And the other is more sort of technical documentation diligence. And this is about being investment ready as a company. This is, are you formed correctly? Are you a C Corp? Do you own your intellectual property? Does everybody have employment agreements? There's just a bunch of paper that needs to go on that matters certainly for the investment going in, but also is something that is going to really matter when someone wants to come and buy you. So you'll hear us talk about a data room, right? It's nothing super fancy, right? It's like a Dropbox folder or a Google Drive or something like that. But that's like all your docs, your corporate formation docs, a lot of it things. We've got a detailed checklist, that we run through on that. So that's a 30 to 60 day process. And the business side of diligence, what we'll do is we'll send you a survey link, right? It's got 10 questions on it. And those 10 questions closely parallel the investment memo that we're writing. And we want you to fill those out. And that's all stuff that should be at your fingertips. If it's not, then it's good. Hopefully, it's the type of thing that most investors' funds are going to ask. So it's not one-off work. Once you've done that, then we schedule a 2-hour call and we go through it and we have conversation, right? And so we're sort of doing a business diligence and we're diving deep in regards to that. We're also kind of looking at the technical documentation to make sure that all works. And if in the course of that time, things go well, continue to go well, we will invite you to present to the investment committee, which is made up of 20 or so folks that are investors in the fund. We've been doing those over Zoom most recently, which works pretty well, actually, I think. And then make a final decision based on that meeting. And so back to kind of conversion rates, even if you get to our investment committee, what we've seen over the course of this fund so far is that only half those companies are getting investment. Right. So it's a rigorous process, right? But it's also designed not to torture you and be pretty direct about what we're probing for and why. And if at any step of that process, we're going to stop, we're going to tell you, and we're going to do our best to tell you why. And sometimes those are problems that we have, right? In terms of our fund, where we are, all these different things can come into it that aren't solvable by you. And some of them are just open questions we may have, on the business or, the investment case of the business. It's never us coming down off the mountaintop and trying to judge you. It's never that, right? It's all about, if I put money in, within a reasonable time period, can I take a significant more money out?
So when we've gone through all those steps, and part of it is that we're really looking at some key areas, and the key areas are actually documented in the investment memo. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the investment memo is structured? Because as an entrepreneur, and having raised money before, what I would, want to know is what is that output and what are those categories so that I can make sure I'm answering the questions and checking the boxes on the categories in that document, because that's really sort of the ticket to pass go, right?
Yeah.
Like a monopoly.
Yeah. So I'll just try and get into it. I think at the core of it is that again, this thing about a document written up, right? There's kind of this summary, and the really anchor in the summary is a question that we articulate, right? Which is, what is the bet? And so there's a super interesting speaker person wrote a book called Thinking in Bets. Her name is Annie Duke, I think.
Yeah, Annie Duke.
Through the internet. Yeah, Annie Duke. So it's just a it wasn't based on that. It was just sort of like, this is the type of thing where you're like trying to isolate things down to like, there's not everything can possibly be known, especially at this stage, but you need to understand the risk that you're taking and the assumptions that you're making about that risk. And so we try to be very articulate about what's the bet. The next thing that was really instructive when when he shared it with us. So there's an amazing person named Jerry Langeler, who very veteran venture capitalist with OVP, has been part of the Oregon Growth Board for years. Just a super awesome guy. I've seen a lot of different things, and he shared this notion of the CESIT framework. Okay, so this is CESIT, CESIT, CESIT. And I think it boils down a lot of things about a fund and how it's looking at an opportunity, right? So the C in CESIT is cash back. So when, as an investor, putting the money in is a lot of work and takes a lot of effort and whatever it is, but you're judged based on how much more comes out. And so you have to, if you're putting money in, then you have to have an articulated scenario that says, I'm going to be able to get my money out, maybe I'll get my money out within a certain time period, and I'm going to be able to get my money out at a certain return, right? So see, cash back. The E of CESIT is execution. And this is what you've accomplished so far, right? One of the questions came in, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. I mean, all those things are like, I've moved beyond just thinking about doing this. And a lot of the entrepreneurial journey, especially if you're a solo entrepreneur, is self-initiated, right? You've got to keep moving and keep moving. It's like, ability to execute, right? Bias for action, all those different types of things that you may read about or hear about in startup lore is about execution. Has this team executed to the stage? It said it was going to do this in Q1. It did this in Q1. It said it was going to do this in Q2. It did this in Q2. So cashback, execution. The S is space, which is the market space, the landscape, the market segment, whatever you want to say. And this is it growing? Is it contracting? Is it dynamic? Is it dominated by, one or two monopoly players? Like, all those things kind of factor into it. So think about a little bit of a market analysis that's going to come around that. And also within that can be, do we understand it? Sometimes, deep science things or some of these other things are a little bit outside of our wheels or our wheelhouse. So that's why we talk about invest in technology and software. When you invest in consumer products, we've got some, knowledge in both of those areas. So cashback, execution, space. The I in CESIT is investor group. So this is your co-investors. This is the people that funded you out of the gate. This is the people that are interested in this round. We're very fortunate, I think, in Oregon. We've got a very collaborative investment environment. The funds all get along. They respect each other. Super, super important. And I think what this is about and getting at is around, look, if you've got, a poorly formed investor group, like let's say you've taken money from an unaccredited investor, like that's a problem, right? Or you've got 600 people on your cap table. That's a problem. Some of these things that kind of get into it. So the co-investor thing matters not so much when the money's going in. It's about as the business grows, the decisions that are made, subsequent funding, all those different things, right? So cashback, execution, the space, and the investor group. And then the T in CESIT is team. right? So that's you, and that's the people that you've surrounded yourself with. It's your command of the problem space. It's all these different things that come into it. And Julie, you and I have talked, in the past around, there's a qualitative piece to this, right? And it's getting at this balance between humility and tenacity, right? As an entrepreneur, you have to be humble in that you don't have it all figured out. So you have to be open to information and open to new inputs, but you have to be tenacious enough, right, to just run 1,000 miles an hour at a direction, right? And if you get kicked in the stomach, right, just keep going after it. So I think it's a balance, right? Humility, tenacity. That's a little more on the qualitative side. And then again, back to team is this a group that is the one to solve this problem? Like, why you? I think that's an important part of it. So yeah, so Seth, I thought, really distilled this down. So if you think about sort of we can get into kind of the mechanics of some of the other sections, right, of what we write up, but it's what's the bet, the CESIT type of framework that Jerry shared, which was so good. And then we also try to align that with what our core investment themes are. So these are on our website, right? We talk about B2B software and orchestration. We talk about digital transformation. We talk about elevated consumer experiences, and access to essential services are kind of our 4 buckets. So we want to make sure that we're thematically aligned as well. So that's sort of our internal justification that we're doing. So anyway, that was a very long answer because there's a lot baked in there.
It was good. It was good. And, so just so everybody knows, what we've been doing is we've been kind of switching off where one of us asked questions of the other. And I thought that was a great explanation. A couple of kind of, use cases. There's some use case questions in our question box here. So one of them is, what's the worst thing that somebody could do? And I have an early answer on that because I've had time to think about it. And then the other is, do you think that the digital ways of assessing companies will remain post COVID-19? So part of, there are a few worse things, I guess I would say, but one of them is not showing up.
Right.
We don't completely understand this, but people will apply and we'll set up a meeting, and then people just won't show up, or they'll forget, or whatever. And that doesn't sound like that big a deal, but in a review process, as investors and actually as entrepreneurs, I think it's a good notion to do this too. Is we're watching kind of every action to see if you're going to be the one and your team is going to be the team to execute. And if you don't show up and you're late and there are a lot of excuses and things like that, things happen, right? We're human beings and things happen, and we understand that. But as Robert is fond of saying, when you're going through the investment cycle, it's never going to get any better than that. So every interaction, we're learning whether you would be a good business partner for us, and you are learning if we would be a good business partner for you.
Yeah, you're essentially running a process, right?
Yeah.
And it's the first exposure we have to you. So how you run, we're not, we're not all that, but like if you get a calendar invite, you accept a calendar invite for a certain date time and you don't show up, right? You'll do that for a distributor. You'll do that for a customer. You'll do that for a potential acquirer, right? So it's an interesting tell. So the process of raising money is a sales process, right? And as an entrepreneur, what you're doing is you're trying to find your most highly qualified, ideal customer profile, ideal investor profile. You're trying to remove as much possible friction out of the process as you can. And you're trying to close the deal. And so like things not to do, like I got one the other day. We get a lot of cold, which is fine. You get a lot of inbound email, right? And then the lens is always, and I try to be responsive. We both try to be responsive, right? It's like, where are you? Right? If you're in New York, we don't invest outside the Pacific Northwest. I write that in so many emails all the time. And then sometimes you get one. I got one the other day that's like, somebody, here's how awesome I am. And, we're only accepting new conversations through June. Right? That's just the wrong, from how we invest and we look at the life cycle that we're going to be working with you. Like, that's not the way to start the relationship, right? Don't hit me with some BS scarcity crap. Julie, you had one where you were very, responsive, and you were like, it was not in our region or whatever it is, and good luck on your raise. And the person responded, thanks, I won't need any luck. Well, okay, I mean, but that's you, right? So it's good. There's a do we want to work together for as long as we're going to work together? So there's a lot of tells that come out of it, but also process, right? Drive the process. It's on you.
And you're hearing a little bit of, some of our frustration about that, because we try to be as accessible as possible. And there's a question about, is there room for me to improve my business during the process? And I would say that's a commitment that we have, is when you go through our process, whether we invest or not, we try to be helpful in terms of, suggestions about your business, suggestions about how to go through the process, how to communicate. And I would say, if you ask, we've done some surveys over the years of entrepreneurs, and we get a pretty high approval rating, even from investors, even from companies that we don't invest in. And that's because we're taking the time, and when we're assessing, we're trying to give actionable feedback from our perspective and from the thesis that we utilize to make those decisions. So what we call that is venture development, and we spend a tremendous amount of time. And in fact, a lot of these screening calls that Robert primarily does is really around that. So for example, if you get into the process and you have one of these calls, we might say, no, we're not interested in having you go through our process now, but here's 3 things that you could do, and come back to us in 90 to 120 days. And if you've checked those things off the list, let's look again.
Yeah, for sure. So it's not a one and done with us. I mean, if we're a no, we try to be explicit why. And so if anybody's on the line and has gotten an email that's a no from us, you'll see there's a couple bullet points, and those bullet points are designed to give you some insight in terms of what the conversation was and what the rationale was. Again, as a both of us being entrepreneurs, the fundraising process is maddening. You don't know where you stand, and that's like literally something that we have just designed, all right, into our business, which is we want to let you know where you stand. We want to let you know what the criteria is. We do our best to make it black and white, but sometimes there is a little bit of gray, and try to get at why. And so if you get a no from any investor, right, there's no harm in putting them on your weekly update, or excuse me, I think monthly is a good interval, right? But a monthly update, right? And that gets back to track record, that gets back to execution, that gets back to a lot of different things, which is just make it the friends of whatever your company name is, email distribution, right? And write a summary. It's a good sort of internal thing for you to check on your progress, but also, if you get a no, right, then let someone know they've missed the opportunity, right? But we're going to be very clear, at least we're going to do our best to be very clear about why it is that we're not ready to move forward, at this particular point in time. And again, sometimes that can be absolutely nothing to do with, like if the business is a pharmaceutical company, right? We don't invest in that because we don't have the fund size to handle, FDA approval processes. We don't have the depth of science expertise, whatever. So that's going to be a no. And that's why, because 1, it doesn't align with any of our 4 themes, right? So again, back to qualification criteria. So you can self-qualify a little bit, and even beyond us, just as an entrepreneur, when you're like wanting to raise money, right? Try to figure out what people invest in, so you're in context, to what they do, and just optimizes your time as well.
Yeah, and we have, I think, a pretty clear outline and context on our website too. So there's some questions, on the floor here around if we've made good progress and we have momentum, but we don't have very much revenue, or we don't have revenue, because we're but we have proof of concept, would we invest? And I think a simple way, and just to go back to this, Robert has said it a couple of times, but it's like, have you built it? You've solved the problem of have you built it, and is anybody interested if you have pilots? But if they'll pay for it is a pretty significant piece of that. So we get a lot of companies that come into the process where, because we're seed stage investors, and typically what that means is that you've utilized your friends and family money or your own funds to get something kicked off. And we're often the first institutional money in. And so for us, it's important that you have some revenue, and or you have a compelling case that says, here's how I'm going to get there from here. So I think that there's more to that, but a lot of times people, I think, are a little bit optimistic about the revenue generation if they haven't had it yet.
Yeah, and I think that just benefits you. I mean, you as the entrepreneur, which is try to go get someone to pay for it. Again, nothing survives outside the four walls and your own assumptions, and that's back to getting roughed up in the marketplace. And so the second box of this whole does anybody care? Again, literally beyond your friends and family, right? Because you're going to have fans, and you're going to have people that really want to support you, and you're going to have a bunch of people that agree with you. Like, go find someone net new that you've never met before and have them validate it. And so it depends. I don't know what the business is, but if this is a mobile app and it's $1.99 and you want to build a business on that and you want to raise money, then your scenario is going to have to be, to get to $1 million in revenue. I always think about this as a milestone, and you need to think about this in your own planning. Like, how many customers do you need to have $1 million in revenue and then hold that, right? So if you're a transactional business, you got to have $1 million in revenue. You got to keep getting that for transactions. If you're a subscription business, once you get there, that's back to the flywheel. You keep it. Great. Well, not everybody's going to stick around as a customer.
Yeah.
So what's the churn rate on the back end? And so if you haven't gone through kind of all that, you maybe you have a product. Let's say it's back to the mobile app, and you're like, I'm doing this, and oh my God, I've got 1,000 people have downloaded this. 800 of them have activated their accounts, and of that 800, 400 are in it every day for 4 hours. Right. So that's enough. That's signal, if you will. It's like, look, this is solving a problem. There's obviously some need. There's obviously some interest. So that's interesting that we could begin to lean forward into that. But we're still going to want to understand once it hits kind of the revenue mark and what that business model is going to look like. So think about $1 million as a breakpoint. Think about $3 million as a breakpoint. Think about 5. That'll help you understand the cost of your business. That'll help you understand how your business can grow. And it gets a little bit beyond the sort of pro forma hockey stick stuff that folks want to see. But I think those are really disciplined steps to go through. So long answer in there in terms of the pre-revenue versus post-revenue thing. But I mean, it is so straightforward and easy, especially if it's an online product, to go get some signal if someone will pay, right? A little harder now in the B2B world. We're all a little disrupted in terms of our locations, but get some initial conversations, right? People are available and accessible, and say, does this solve the problem that you have? I mean, at least that'll help you a little bit.
Yeah, and there's a question about how best to move from concept or pre-seed to seed stage, and I think you just described that, right? Most seed stage investors are going to require you to have some revenue, and that's it's the most expensive part of raising money is when you're this size. So being prudent about how you value the company, and also these due diligence steps that we've described that we go through with you. It's a good idea for you to go through with the investors in the sense of making sure there's a business alignment, because once you take outside investment, that person, that fund, that angel investor, that fund becomes a business partner pretty much for the life of your business. And there are a lot of things that can go wrong.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the whole sort of like pre-revenue versus post-revenue thing and concept stage funding. I mean, again, this is back to the investors you get in front of, right? We're not going to invest in an idea. There are people that'll do that, but that's not what we do, because again, back to the E in the CESIP framework around execution is, ideas are cheap, right? Everybody can have an idea, right? But how are you actually beginning to implement that? And I think you show advancements on the product side, you show advancements, in terms of adoption and usage. And again, the revenue thing it's more validation of the business model. Again, I have an entrepreneur friend of mine many years ago. We were sitting in a outside little patio area in Atlanta where I used to live, beautiful spring day, and we were talking about it, and I kind of wide-eyed. I was like, I'm going to do all these things or whatever. He's like, Robert, what you got to understand is you have to visualize. You tell me about your thing, or you show me your thing, and I take $1 out of my pocket and I hand it to you for that, right? Without that, then it's an academic exercise. So that doesn't mean, you got to have $5 million in revenue and validate or whatever, but it's like that dimension of your business is super important, because one of the questions that came in here is at seed or whatever it is, like how much of your business do you sell? As an entrepreneur, when you're raising money, your goal is to sell as little of your business as possible at each stage of funding. So you retain as much ownership as you can, right? And the more that you mature your business, I built it, people care enough to pay, the value of the business has risen. So when you get into a negotiation with an investor, you have some leverage, right? And even more so, we had a conversation with an entrepreneur, earlier, I guess it was last week or so, and he's got a business, right? And funding is a lever he can throw if he wants to. Like, really great position to be in. I mean, he wants to grow faster and he wants to attract capital and whatever it is, but it's not like, man, it's 30 days and I hit a brick wall that I don't get a check, right? Because you do not want to enter the fundraising process in desperation any more than you want to enter, going and trying to find a job in desperation. Even if you are freaking out, right? The goal is you got to be calm and focused, right? About what it is you want to do. So yeah, I get the, there's a lot of narrative that floats around about early stage funding, and it's hard to get and whatever. And again, as a fund, we raise money from other people. We're responsible to those people. That's why we have a process. I would argue our process is very efficient and very quick. An individual angel investor may have a shorter process. They may sit around across the table from you at breakfast and decide you're an awesome person and write you a check for $25,000. But that's a different type of funding mechanism, than it's going to come out of a fund. It's a smaller check size and it's going to come out of a fund.
And I think, we've talked about this in a lot of different ways before, but I think understanding what type of business you have and what kind of entrepreneur you are is important. So we see a lot of businesses, and Robert has talked about this, but we see a lot of businesses that are going to have the potential to be great businesses, but they're not going to scale to the point of having a 5 to 7 or 5 to 10x return on revenue. It's just not going to be that kind of business. So you can have you can have a great business that makes $1 million, $2 million, and support your family and some employees and do good in your community and all those things. But that's not going to be the kind of business that we invest in. And the other thing I think that's really important to understand from our perspective is we see a handful of hundreds, say a couple hundred deals a year or more. And we only invest in 5 to 7 of those businesses. So it's an extremely competitive process. And, if there was more money available in Oregon, or, the fund was a little bit larger, we would do more. But we think that this fund is right-sized for the region and for Oregon in terms of where we sit with seed stage investing.
Yeah, back to kind of our metrics that we measure in terms of screening calls that we do with awesome people, and then all the way to making investments. Like the conversion rate, I don't have it up in front of me, but I believe from like all the screening 30-minute calls we have to actually completing an investment is right around 5%. Right. So, that doesn't mean the deck's stacked against you. That just means that we try to be very rigorous about what we're doing and how we're doing it. And there's a question that's come in here, which I think is a good one. Just to put some more context around, it says not to put the cart in front of the horse, but if the exit strategy is 5 to 8 years, but there is an opportunity to exit with success prior, will the agreement allow for that? So the time frame here, this is a fund constraint, not necessarily an entrepreneurial constraint. So when you create a venture fund, they have 10-year lives, right? Set up for 10 years and whatever. And so what you're trying to do is trying to put money in the first couple of years, right? Maybe do some follow on in the mid years, and then in the out years, you expect to essentially get returns. So when you take money from a fund, you are sort of arbitrarily limiting the timeline that you're trying to execute against. So my 5 to 8 years, 4 to 7, whatever, is me just kind of spitballing a little bit. But yeah, if there's an opportunity ahead of that's significant, then I think that's absolutely part of it. What you'll get into then is, your board of directors will essentially need to support that deal. If you have external investors, depending on, this is back to having really competent counsel as you raise money, will have to weigh in some way, shape, or form, right? Whether they have to get a majority of preferred shareholders or some shareholder consent, on a sale of a business. So yeah, I think that it's and this is this nuance between, when you have a pitch deck, you don't want to say, I'm going to sell my business in 8 years for this amount of money, right? Because you don't know. But back to space in our CESIT framework, right? There is some value to showing other activity that's happened in the space that you're in. This company bought this company, this company bought this company, this company, and it was for this much money. Just to sort of say, this is an acquisitive space that I'm in. So someone can sort of visualize, there's a way out of this, right? Cash back. So I think those are super important things. But yeah, I go back to, being investment ready is something that I think needs a lot more emphasis. And that's not just around concept and shipping and all this other stuff. This is like, are you incorporated correctly? Do you have two founders that left the business that own 70% of it, right? Because you didn't have everybody on vesting schedules out of the gate, and therefore you're not going to be incented correctly. When you take on investors, like that's something that that's radioactive, right? To investor groups. Intellectual property assignment and ownership, right? You could build a business, you could be great. If you don't get that right out of the gate because you hired a contractor and you didn't paper it correctly, and then someone wants to come buy you for $500 million, but you find out you don't own the core intellectual property, like that's a problem. So those are things that are like, that's when like you'll get into it and it's like, why didn't so-and-so, raise the money, right? The investors pulled back. I mean, sometimes you can't make an investment because those things aren't done correctly.
Yeah. And that's a really common challenge, because most people start companies because they have a good idea, and the idea and the running of the business are two different things. So you have to get really good at running a business. And this is why a lot of times when investors look at entrepreneurs, they'll say, have you done this before? Because if you've done it once or twice, you've probably made every mistake in the book. And so part of what we're trying to do in these conversations is help say, here's where potential potholes are that are going to slow down your progress in terms of your, advancing towards success as a business or as a potential investment.
We're getting a lot of really good questions. So clearly whatever we're talking about is stimulating some good thinking. So thank you all for sharing. There's a good one in here, Justin, that you shared. What are your thoughts on a business that has Amazon as a sales vertical or is involved in Amazon in some form or fashion? I guess I think about this broadly in terms of distribution, right? If you're 100% reliant on Amazon, you have risk because you have platform risk. You have platform risk because that's your one channel of distribution. The price pressure is ridiculous. It's like the old school selling through Walmart, right? They tell you how much money you're going to make. They tell you your profit margins. They tell you your packaging. Broadly, when we look at direct-to-consumer businesses and the ones that we've invested in, you'll find that they've got a direct relationship with the customer, which I think is super important for two reasons. One, you're not sharing anything to a third party. And two, man, that's your fan base. And literally, like when we've made some investments in direct-to-consumer companies, we'll go to the Instagram, right, and page, and we'll see they post something like, how engaged are people, right? And it doesn't have to be thousands, right? But it's like, is there this sort of organic sort of passion around the product or around the brand? I think that's a really important signal, and that's really, I think, something you can capture, in that direct-to-consumer model. So if you have a direct-to-consumer model, that lets you manage your inventory a little tighter, right? And then maybe you've got a wholesale channel, so you sell through a little bit of retail, and then Amazon is a thing. So sometimes Amazon's presence is more defensive than anything else, right? Just to have yourself there. But your margins are going to be worse on the whole than they will be with a direct business. So I don't, things as we get into it that have 80% of your flow through is through Amazon aren't as appealing, right? We really want to see that direct relationship with the customer base, and again, passionate sort of buy-in of the mission and the purpose of the brand is super important.
There's also a question about what do we put on in our deck as far as potential revenue and potential total market, and is there a formula for that? And I would say it was interesting because when I read that question, I thought, often when I see that slide, I just disregard it because it's usually so incredibly inflated, seems incredibly inflated to me, and isn't necessarily explained in a way that has evidence behind it. So I would say if you're talking about potential revenue, the best way to do that is to look at the total market and to research to see if there are studies around what you're trying to do or whatever, and estimate that based on some sort of realistic projection that makes sense to you as the founder, rather than just using a formula that says, well, the total market is 200 billion and I'm going to get 17% of that. Like, what is that based on?
Yeah. Good points. And good question. I kind of feel the same way, right? I know there's a lot of emphasis on market size, and again, this goes back to the S in says it, the space. As we go through our analysis, and we have a market section in our investment memo, right? We generally enjoy third-party research validation, right? And so if you're working on a business and McKinsey did a study saying here's like 4 mega trends that mean you're going to be successful, like that's a good input, right? It's like third party that has come in and done that, or sort of market sizing. I think those are important things, especially if you're in a real focus. Like we kind of invested in a sports analytics company called Edge Sports, and there were some overtones in terms of fan engagement, daily fantasy sports, sports betting, some of these other things. And there was a really nicely done PricewaterhouseCoopers state of the industry report that was a good input to us. And as a company, you can have those and you can make those available to your investors, right? Do the work for them. Back to taking friction out of the process. I think that's important. But back to the market size thing, what I generally want to poke on, and this is kind of a B2B lens, is I'm a little more interested in the ideal customer profile or your assumption around it and how many of those there are.
Yeah.
I'm going to sell to mid-size manufacturers in North America. Great. How many of those are there? There's 17,000 or whatever the number is. Okay, great. Your average contract value, you believe, is $100,000, right? And so there's the math that says, I know who I'm selling to because I know they have this problem. Maybe I've got some validation. They'll pay this much for it. So here's the sort of the near-term grasp that I can do. And then it's okay, right? So for icing on the cake to say, and then globally, it's a big, it's a multi-billion-dollar spin. But I think it's much more sort of granular to know bottom up versus top down. To, hey, it's a $7 trillion market, and if I get 1%, like we can all do math, right? That's not rocket science. But the bottom up is much more. This type of person spends this kind of money on this, and here's why I'm successful. And here's my use stats that say they're spending N number of hours a day in my app. Like those are really important, I think, inputs to it. So that may fly in the face of a lot of pitch deck coaching and whatever else. But I think to benefit you, back to the E in Sessit and execution, is if you know by name your target customers, then it's just about reach. It's about getting after them, right? As opposed to like, I did this macro study and now I still have to go build a list of company names, email addresses, and phone numbers.
So we're at the end of our time. I wanted to thank everybody, and thank you, Robert, for sharing your insights and your wisdom. We're going to, so this is our 6th one of these. We're going to shift now, do these probably at the same time, a little bit more flexibly, and do them as office hours for people to chime in with any questions that they have. So stay tuned on our channels for announcements of the dates and times of those. And thanks again for participating today. Do you have any final comment, Robert?
No, other than awesome questions. Thanks everyone for the time and the brain power. And again, this is opinion, 2 people's opinion, that hopefully is at least maybe can help you refine your thinking a little bit as you go about your day.
Yeah, have a good day. Stay safe. Be well.
All right. Always a pleasure to talk to you, Julie Harrelson.
Yeah, you too, Robert Pease. Bye for now.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.